On a crowded Friday night, 3 drunk cops thought they could humiliate 2 black sisters in front of everyone. What they didn't know. These women weren't just victims, they were FBI agents. And by the end of the night, the entire town, and the whole country, would never be the same. Friday night at Millstone Bar carried the usual hum of clinking glasses and muffled laughter, the kind of small-town noise that made strangers blend into the background. Danielle and Dominique Carter sat together at a corner table, not dressed to impress, not looking for trouble, just 2 sisters catching up after a long week. Their drinks rested untouched in front of them as neon lights painted their skin in shades of blue and red. They could almost pretend the world outside didn't exist, until it did. The door banged open and 3 men stumbled in, uniforms hanging loose around their waists, badges glinting faintly on their belts. Off-duty but not off-power, and already soaked in whiskey. Sergeant Rick Dalton led the pack, his broad shoulders filling the doorway, his bloodshot eyes scanning the room like he owned it. Mark Stevens and Kyle Boyd followed close, laughing too loudly at a joke no one else had heard. The crowd recognized them instantly. In this town, everyone did. Heads lowered. Conversations faded. The only sound left was the bass line of the jukebox and the heavy steps of 3 men who believed rules bent to their will. They spotted the Carter sisters almost immediately. Rick's smirk stretched wide as he veered toward their table. "Well now, look what we have here," he drawled, dragging a chair across the floor with a screech that set teeth on edge. He flipped it backward and straddled it, leaning in far too close to Danielle. "Didn't know the circus was in town." Mark positioned himself behind Dominique, meaty hands gripping her chair as if he owned the right. Kyle swayed on his feet, his grin sloppy, his voice a drunken slur. "Double the beauty, huh? Or should I say double the chocolate?" His crude gesture made a few patrons wince, but no one spoke. Danielle straightened her spine, her voice calm but firm. "Back off." Rick's eyes glinted with amusement. He leaned closer, his breath thick with alcohol. "Or what, sweetheart? You gonna teach me a lesson?" His words hung heavy in the air. The bar quieted further, a suffocating silence pressing down on every table. Luis, the bartender, froze mid-wipe on a glass, jaw tight, eyes flicking nervously toward the sisters. A woman at the counter grabbed her purse and slipped out the door without looking back. The Carter sisters sat still, statues carved from patience, but their eyes told a different story. Dominique's grip on her glass tightened. Danielle's gaze never wavered from Rick's. Everyone in the room felt the shift, the kind that makes your pulse quicken before the first storm cloud breaks. Rick chuckled low, enjoying the discomfort radiating from every corner. He looked over his shoulder at his friends. "They don't teach manners where these girls come from." Mark laughed, pressing down harder on Dominique's chair. "Maybe we should show them some." The words dropped like stones into water. Still no one moved. No one dared. All eyes flicked down into drinks, screens, anywhere but the unfolding scene. The Carter sisters were on their own, and the town had made its choice, silence. Danielle spoke again, her tone colder now, cutting through the tension. "This is your last warning." For a heartbeat the bar went utterly still. Even the jukebox seemed to falter. Then Rick leaned back in his chair, smirk unbroken, eyes gleaming with the kind of power drunk men wield when they know no one will stop them. The Carter sisters remained calm, but the message was clear, no help was coming. In that silence, every patron felt it, the rubber band had stretched to its limit, and something was going to snap. Rick tilted his chair forward, invading Danielle's space until the smell of liquor and sweat filled her lungs. His voice dropped to a mocking whisper that still carried across the silent bar. "Ladies like you ought to know better. Coming in here dressed like that, acting like you belong." His words dripped with disdain, every syllable sharpened to cut. Danielle didn't flinch, her dark eyes steady, but Dominique felt the pressure of Mark's heavy hands clamp down harder on the back of her chair. He leaned close enough that his breath brushed her neck. "Don't they teach respect where you come from? His tone was playful in the way a predator plays with prey. Dominique's jaw tightened but her face remained a mask of calm. Kyle swayed closer, grinning stupidly, raising his hands in an exaggerated hourglass shape. "Look at these curves, Sarge. Double the chocolate, double the fun." His crude laughter echoed in the hushed room. A man at a nearby table shifted uncomfortably but kept his eyes glued to his drink. A woman clutched her purse and slipped out the door, her heels clicking fast against the wood floor, leaving behind only the silence of people who didn't want to be involved. Luis, behind the bar, stopped wiping glasses. His eyes locked on Rick, then on Danielle, and back again. The rag twisted tighter in his hands as if he could strangle the tension itself. He started forward, but Rick cut his glance sideways, a warning so sharp Luis froze in place. "Don't get any ideas, barkeep," Rick growled without even turning his head. "Be a shame if the health inspector had to pay you a visit. Or immigration." Luis's face flushed red, but his shoulders sank. He retreated to his post, a man strangled by the leash of fear, and the Carter sisters knew they were alone. Rick dragged his finger across the rim of Danielle's glass, slow and taunting. "How about you smile for us, sweetheart? That's what you're here for, isn't it?" Danielle's voice came steady, calm as steel. "Take your hand away." The smirk on his face widened as though her resistance was the very fuel he wanted. Behind her, Dominique went rigid as Mark's hand slid from her chair to her shoulders, pressing down hard. "Relax," he crooned in a false soothing tone. "We're just being friendly." Dominique's lips parted just enough for her words to cut through the haze. "Don't touch me." Mark chuckled low in his throat and squeezed tighter. "Or what? You going to call the police?" The cruel humor of the line sent the three of them into ugly laughter. The bar filled with the sound of power masquerading as comedy. Kyle stumbled closer, nearly toppling the table with his hip, sloshing their untouched drinks onto the wood. "Oops. Guess I'm clumsy. Maybe you should clean it up for me, huh?" His face dropped within inches of Dominique's. "Or maybe you'd rather give me something better to look at." Danielle's hand twitched toward her purse, a movement born of instinct and training, but Dominique caught her sister's eye, the faintest shake of her head halting her. "Not yet." Their silent language, years in the making, spoke louder than any words. "Hold. Wait." Rick caught the exchange and leaned back with a grin, savoring the tension like a man savoring a fine drink. "Got something in that purse you want to share with the class, princess?" Danielle answered without hesitation, her tone smooth, even playful. "Just my lipstick. Doubt it's your shade." The jab earned her a deeper scowl. Mark's grip dug into Dominique's shoulders, hard enough to make her wince. "See that? No respect for authority. That's what's wrong with you too. But don't worry, we can fix that." His hand began to slide lower, too familiar, too deliberate. Dominique's muscles coiled like a spring, every instinct screaming to break free. For an instant her hands twitched against the table, ready to strike. But then her eyes met Danielle's. The same silent exchange passed between them, a warning and a promise. "Not yet." Danielle's voice broke the silence once more, steady and commanding. "Walk away while you still can." The words cut across the room, a challenge laid bare. Rick's face darkened, the smile fading to something colder, meaner. He leaned forward again, his shadow swallowing the sisters in the neon light. The crowd of patrons shifted uneasily, but no one rose, no one spoke. Every head bowed lower, every pair of eyes turned away. The Carter sisters sat isolated under the weight of silence. Dominique's heart pounded, her body a taut wire ready to snap, but she held still, forcing the fury back into her veins. The tension in the room had grown unbearable, the kind that presses on the chest until breathing itself feels dangerous. One wrong move and everything would detonate. The sisters knew it. The crowd knew it. And the cops, drunk on power, were daring them to strike first. Rick's patience ended in a snap. He shoved his chair back so hard it screeched across the floor and stood looming over the Carter sisters. "Enough of this," he barked, his voice cutting through the silence like a whip. Before Danielle could rise, Mark seized her wrist and yanked her up from the chair, twisting her arm behind her back with brutal force. The sudden motion drew a sharp cry from her throat as her cheek slammed against the rough wooden wall. The bar went utterly still, every patron frozen in place, eyes glued to the table or their drinks, anything to avoid the scene unfolding in the open. Dominique shot to her feet, but Kyle was already there, grinning as he shoved her hard. She stumbled backward, knees buckling, crashing onto the sticky floor. His hands were quick, pulling the cuffs from his belt with a drunken flourish. The metallic clink of steel echoed across the room. In one practiced motion, he yanked her arms behind her back and locked them tight. The sound of the click was louder than the jukebox, louder than the shallow breathing of the crowd. Dominique's breath hitched as the cuffs dug into her skin, sharper with every move Kyle made to tighten them further. Danielle struggled against the wall, teeth gritted, but Mark's bulk pressed her down, his forearm pinning her collarbone. "Stay still, sweetheart, unless you want resisting arrest added to your charges." Rick prowled around them like a vulture, eyes gleaming with triumph. "Disorderly conduct. Threatening an officer. We've got a whole list waiting." He said it loud enough for everyone to hear, daring anyone to object. No one did. A young man in the corner lifted his phone, trying to record discreetly, but Rick's sharp whistle made Kyle lunge forward. "No cameras," Kyle snarled, smacking the phone from the man's hand. It shattered on the hardwood, screen exploding into shards. The young man sank back into his chair, eyes wide, lips pressed tight with fear. Dominique shifted on her knees, forcing herself upright despite the cuffs. Her shoulders burned from the unnatural angle, but she kept her head high. Mark's grip on Danielle only grew rougher, his fingers digging into her hair as he shoved her back against the wall. "See how quick your attitude disappears in cuffs," he hissed, his lips close to her ear. Danielle's chest heaved with effort, her voice low but steady. "You're making a mistake." Rick leaned in close enough for the bar to smell the whiskey on his breath. "No, darling. You made the mistake the second you walked into my town." Louis stepped out from behind the bar, tray of glasses in hand like a flimsy excuse. His jaw was clenched, his knuckles white, but still he moved. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice strained. "Let them go. They haven't done anything." Rick turned his head slowly, eyes narrowing at the bartender. "Go back to washing dishes before I decide to check your papers again." The words cut deeper than a blade. Louis froze in place, the tray trembling in his grip, then backed away, his face flushed with rage and helplessness. Rick smirked, satisfied. "Smart man." He turned his attention back to Dominique, reaching down and gripping her chin between his fingers. "Look at you, down on your knees. About time someone put you in your place." Dominique jerked her face free, disgust carved into every line. Kyle's laugh rang out, cruel and boyish, as he shoved her shoulder. "Not so tough now, huh? Thought you girls had fire." He leaned close to whisper in her ear, his tone dripping with mockery. "Bet you dance real nice though." The room seemed to shrink, every set of shoulders curling inward. The humiliation burned hotter than the cuffs, hotter than the bruises forming under their skin. The Carter sisters were on display, paraded as trophies of dominance in a town that thrived on silence. Danielle's eyes found Dominique's across the chaos. Despite the forearm crushing her chest, despite the pain twisting her wrist, her gaze was steady. Dominique met it with equal fire. For a fleeting moment the noise, the laughter, the humiliation, all of it dissolved into a private conversation only sisters could have. A promise. A warning. A vow. Rick barked an order and Mark yanked Danielle from the wall, dragging her toward the door. Kyle jerked Dominique upright by the cuffs, forcing her to stumble across the floor. Patrons parted like water, making a clear path, avoiding eye contact as if shame could not touch them if they looked away. The sisters were marched toward the exit, the neon lights painting harsh shadows on their faces. Outside, a patrol car waited, its lights dark, engine already running. Rick pushed the door open wide and held it with mock chivalry. Ladies first. As Dominique passed, she turned her head just enough to lock eyes with him. Her glare cut colder than any words could, her silence sharper than any threat. It was not submission. It was a promise that the night was far from over. Rick's smirk faltered, just for a breath, before he shoved her forward. The bar door slammed shut behind them, leaving only the echo of silence, and the weight of a town that had chosen to look away. The holding cells stank of bleach and old sweat, the kind of sterile rot that clung to the walls long after the mop dried. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, bleaching the world in sickly white. Danielle and Dominique were shoved inside, cuffs still biting their wrists. Rick leaned against the bars, arms folded, his grin smug and heavy with liquor. "Welcome home, ladies. Don't get too comfortable. We've got a long night ahead." Kyle tossed the key ring from hand to hand, jangling it like a toy. "Think the FBI's gonna come running for you? Guess again. Nobody's watching. Nobody cares." His words dripped with satisfaction as if humiliating them wasn't enough. Mark prowled between the cells, his boots echoing on the linoleum floor. He stopped in front of Dominique, eyes roaming over her with a cruelty that made bile rise in her throat. "You know what I see? Two girls who thought they could walk in here and act better than us. Maybe a night in here will remind you how small you really are." He gripped the bars, pressing his face close, the smell of whiskey thick. "Or maybe we teach you some respect right now." Danielle moved instantly, her voice sharp as a blade. "Touch her and you'll regret it." Rick's laughter filled the room, ugly and loud. "Regret it? Sweetheart, you're not in charge anymore. We are." He stepped inside Dominique's cell, the metallic screech of the door slicing through the silence. His hand reached toward her, deliberate, slow, daring her to resist. Dominique's pulse hammered, every instinct screaming to fight. But instead, she let her body stiffen, her hands trembling slightly as if fear had won. In that calculated stillness, she shifted her weight, fingers brushing against the badge case hidden at her waistband. With a subtle flick, it slipped free, falling heavy onto the concrete. The golden shield gleamed under the fluorescent light, its reflection dancing across the cell floor. For a heartbeat, the room froze. Even Rick paused, eyes locking on the unmistakable seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Dominique's voice rang out steady and cold, echoing in the silence. "Federal agents. You've just assaulted federal agents." Danielle stepped forward, her chin raised despite the bruises blooming across her skin. "You're not just drunk cops anymore. You're criminals. And every witness here just saw it." The air shifted. Luis's warning eyes from the bar, the silent phone slipping into pockets, the truth dangling in that badge, it all came rushing back to the onlookers' minds. Rick's jaw tightened, his grin faltering for the first time. Mark stepped back a half pace, uncertain. Kyle swallowed, his bravado cracking. For a flicker of a moment, hope surged. Then Rick bent down, slow and deliberate, and kicked the badge across the floor. The clatter of metal against concrete rang louder than any confession. He smirked again, darker now, eyes narrowing on Dominique. "You think that little piece of tin saves you? This is my town. My rules. Out there, maybe that badge matters. But here, you're nothing." He jerked his chin at Kyle. "Tighten those cuffs. Show them who's in charge." Kyle rushed forward, yanking Dominique's wrists higher until pain shot through her shoulders. She gasped, her body straining against the steel. Danielle slammed her fists against the bars, fury breaking through her calm. "You're digging your own grave." Rick leaned close, his breath sour with whiskey. "Funny, sweetheart, because from where I'm standing, you're the ones buried. Mark chuckled, regaining his nerve, and spat on the floor between their cells. Federal agents, huh? Guess that makes tonight even sweeter. The sisters locked eyes through the bars, silent communication sparking like electricity. They had played their card, revealed their truth, and the predators hadn't retreated. Instead, the mask had fallen away, exposing something worse. This wasn't drunken bravado. This was a system built on rot, one where even an FBI badge couldn't protect them. Danielle's voice dropped low, deadly calm. Then you've declared war. Rick smiled thin and cruel, his confidence restored. Good. Because we've been waiting for a fight. In that sterile, buzzing room, the truth became undeniable. The sisters weren't facing three drunk cops. They were staring into the heart of corruption itself, and the system had just shown it would fight to protect its own. The hours inside the station bled together, measured only by the buzz of the fluorescent lights and the scrape of boots along the corridor. Danielle paced her cell, 6 steps one way, 6 steps back, her bare feet slapping against the concrete. Dominique sat stiffly on the metal bunk, her eyes fixed on the hallway, every muscle coiled. The weight of humiliation still clung to them, but beneath it, calculation simmered. That was when Officer Jenny Morales appeared, her footsteps soft, her uniform too crisp, her face carrying the taut expression of someone walking a knife's edge. She slid 2 paper bags through the slot of Danielle's cell, announcing loudly, "Dinner. Standard issue sandwich and chips." But as Danielle took the bag, she felt something thin brush her palm. A folded note. Morales moved to Dominique's cell, her voice barely above a whisper as she handed over the second meal. "Don't trust anyone here. This isn't the first time." Then, louder, "Water fountains broken, so you'll have to make do with cups." She walked away briskly, never looking back. Danielle waited until the corridor emptied before she carefully unfolded the note under her blanket. A phone number written in tight, neat handwriting. Beside it, emergency FBI contact. Deputy Director Marcus Chen. For a moment, hope sparked in the cold fluorescent air. They had a lifeline. Later that night, as the sisters exchanged quiet whispers through the bars, Luis's voice slipped in from the far end of the hallway. He had managed to talk his way past a guard, delivering a crate of supplies to the station's back room. His eyes found Dominique's through the bars, and with the faintest tilt of his head, he tapped his apron pocket. The faint red glow of a recording light blinked inside. He had video. Not just fragments, but the whole assault at the bar. Proof that the sisters had been attacked, proof of the officer's brutality. His lips barely moved as he mouthed, "I have everything." Dominique's chest tightened with relief, but she kept her expression neutral. Rick was nearby, lounging at the booking desk, scribbling false reports with Mark and Kyle. Luis walked away before anyone noticed, but his silent promise lingered. Hours passed before another ally appeared, one the sisters never expected. Maya Green, a journalist known for chasing stories no one else dared touch, arrived at the station under the guise of interviewing the sisters about their charges. Guards smirked as they let her into the grimy interview room. "Press wants to hear about the troublemakers," one jeered. Maya sat down, set a recorder on the table, and leaned close, her blazer neat, her eyes sharp with fire. "Luis contacted me," she whispered as she adjusted her microphone. "He says he has footage. And I know more. Judge Clarence Wilkes has been collecting evidence for years. Police corruption, falsified reports, planted evidence. He's been waiting for the right moment, and he believes this is it." Dominique's breath caught. Wilkes was a retired circuit judge, respected and feared in equal measure. If he was involved, it meant the rot went deeper than a few bad cops. Maya scribbled notes on her pad, her words for show, but her hand wrote a time and an address. Meeting tonight. Wilkes's house. Luis bringing footage. The sisters' eyes burned with new determination. They weren't alone. The seeds of resistance were taking root. But even as Maya's hope filled the room, a shadow fell. Danielle was escorted back to her cell, and a phone call was allowed under standard procedure. She dialed the number Morales had given them. The line rang, then clicked. Deputy Director Chen, came a calm voice. "Sir, it's Agent Danielle Carter. We're being held illegally. We have evidence of systemic corruption. We need immediate extraction." There was a pause. Then Chen's tone shifted, colder, cautious. "Carter, listen carefully. I've already spoken with Chief Holt. He tells me you and your sister assaulted his men, resisted arrest, fabricated wild stories. He says you're unstable." Danielle's blood ran cold. "That's a lie. We have proof. We have witnesses. Louise has video." "Enough," Chen cut her off. "You don't understand. Some battles aren't worth fighting. Drop this, both of you. Cooperate, take the disorderly conduct charges, and walk away. That's an order." His words were final, heavy with betrayal. Dominique, listening from the other cell, went rigid, her knuckles white as she gripped the bars. "You're covering for them," Danielle spat, her voice low with fury. "You're complicit." But the line had already gone dead. Silence swallowed the cell block, broken only by the distant laugh of Rick and his men. The sisters stared at each other through the bars, the truth cutting deeper than any wound. The FBI itself had turned its back. Their own chain of command had chosen corruption over justice. The phone call had slammed every official door shut. Whatever fight remained would be theirs alone. Hope that had flickered moments before was crushed under the weight of betrayal, leaving behind only a sharper, colder fire. They were done waiting for cavalry. Now it was war. The van jolted to a stop on a dirt road that smelled of swamp water and rot. Danielle and Dominique were dragged out into the night air, wrists shackled, bare feet scraping against gravel. Before them loomed an abandoned warehouse, its broken windows gaping like black eyes, the moonlight pouring through holes in the rusted roof. Rats scattered as the doors screeched open. Rick shoved Danielle forward, his grin a twisted mask of triumph. "End of the line, sweetheart. No cameras, no witnesses, no one to hear you scream." Kyle chuckled, swinging his baton idly, while Mark cracked his knuckles. The sisters were pushed inside, stumbling onto the concrete floor. The smell of oil and rust clung to the air, every shadow alive with menace. Rick circled them slowly, savoring their vulnerability. "You thought you were special," he sneered. "FBI agents. Untouchable. But tonight, you're just two more bodies no one will miss." Dominique's eyes followed his every step, her mind racing through options. The cuffs bit into her wrists, cutting off circulation, but she shifted subtly, working the small hairpin she had hidden in her braid. Danielle caught the motion, and with a faint nod, shifted too, angling her body to shield her sister's hands from view. Rick leaned in close to Danielle, pressing the barrel of his pistol against her temple. "Any last words?" She met his gaze, unblinking. "Cowards need guns. Real men don't." Rage flickered across his face, his finger twitching on the trigger. But before he could react, Dominique's cuffs clicked open. With lightning precision, she lunged upward, slamming her shoulder into Mark's gut. He staggered back, wheezing. Danielle twisted hard, kicking Rick's knee and sending the pistol clattering across the floor. Kyle roared and swung his baton, but Danielle ducked, her legs sweeping his ankles out from under him. He crashed to the ground, his head bouncing against concrete. The fight exploded, brutal and fast. Mark came charging, fists wild, but Dominique was already moving. Her elbow cracked against his jaw, then she spun, hooking his arm and flipping him hard onto the floor. Rick lunged for his gun, but Danielle was faster. She dove, snatched it, and tossed it across the room. The sisters moved in perfect sync, every strike, every block a seamless flow of training and instinct. Yet the odds pressed hard. Rick grabbed a rusted chain from the floor and whipped it through the air. It cracked against Dominique's shoulder, sending her stumbling. Kyle, bleeding from his temple, crawled toward a small device on the ground, the sisters' hidden camera, which Danielle had triggered in the scuffle. Its red light blinked faintly, transmitting everything. Kyle's hand closed around it. "Not so fast," he snarled, raising it high to smash it against the concrete. Panic surged, but then the tiny screen on Danielle's wrist beeped. A text flashed, signal locked. Morales had hacked in remotely, securing the live stream feed. The camera flickered but stayed alive. Kyle's eyes widened in horror as the red light blinked brighter. Dominique lunged, her boot connecting with his chest, knocking him back before he could try again. Rick realized too late what was happening. His threats, his violence, his words, all of it was being broadcast. Fury twisted his face. He charged Danielle with a roar, but she sidestepped, her fist slamming into his ribs. He staggered, then spat blood, staring into the blinking red light. "You think anyone cares?" he shouted, his voice ragged. "This is how it's always been. My town. My rules. Nobody saves you here." His words hung in the air, damning him more than any strike could. Dominique pinned Mark with his own cuffs, chaining him to a steel beam. Danielle disarmed Kyle completely, tossing his baton aside. They dragged Rick to his knees, forcing him to face the camera. Danielle leaned close, her voice sharp as glass. "Tell them, Rick. Tell the world who you really are." He struggled, sweat dripping, teeth bared. But the liquor and rage loosened his tongue. "You don't get it," he spat. "We've been running this county for years. Planting evidence. Beating whoever we want. Judges, prosecutors, they're all in our pocket. Even your FBI boss signed off." His chest heaved, his face twisted, and still he ranted. "People like you don't belong here. We put them in their place. We keep order. Our order." Every word streamed live. Morales shared the feed across social media, the viewer count climbing by the second. Phones buzzed in living rooms, newsrooms, government offices. Hashtags erupted online. The corruption that had thrived in silence was now naked before the world. Rick's voice cracked as realization dawned, but it was too late. Danielle shoved him forward, his face caught in the glow of the camera. "Checkmate," she said coldly. "The world just saw who you are." Outside, the faint sound of sirens began to rise, growing louder with every second. Tactical units, alerted by the live stream, converged on the warehouse. Mark whimpered against the steel beam, Kyle groaned on the floor, and Rick, once so untouchable, sagged in his cuffs, broken not by fists but by his own confession. The Carter sisters stood tall in the moonlight streaming through the broken roof, their bodies bruised, their breaths ragged, but unbowed. They had gambled everything on that tiny red light. And it had worked. The predators were caged, and the world was finally watching. Morning light spilled across the town square, turning brick walls golden and casting long shadows on the swelling crowd. News vans lined the streets, antennas raised high, cameras rolling. The live stream from the warehouse had detonated overnight, spreading faster than any local authority could contain. Now the whole country was watching. Danielle and Dominique Carter stepped out of the federal building, their wrists still red from the cuffs, bruises stark against their skin, but their posture unbroken. They walked side by side down the steps, the noise of the crowd swelling into a roar. People chanted their names, held signs demanding justice, raised fists high in solidarity. Reporters surged forward, microphones extended, but the sisters didn't flinch. They were not victims being paraded. They were victors, carrying themselves with quiet defiance. Across town, arrests were already underway. Chief Holt was led out of the police station in handcuffs, his silver hair slicked back but his face grim, cameras capturing every step of his downfall. Officers who had once feared him now turned away, some already speaking with federal investigators. At the FBI field office, Robert Keene, the supervisor who had betrayed them, was escorted out under the same flashing lights, his polished career crumbling into disgrace. The crowd outside the courthouse swelled as the news spread. The system that had silenced people for decades was finally cracking. Black families who had endured years of harassment stood shoulder to shoulder with young activists, their voices rising as one. "No more fear," they shouted. "Justice now." Danielle reached the podium hastily set up at the top of the courthouse steps. She gripped the sides, her badge glinting faintly in the morning light. The crowd hushed, anticipation electric. Her voice carried, steady and strong. "Last night, they tried to break us. They thought cuffs and walls could strip us of our dignity. They were wrong. But this is bigger than us. This is for every person they targeted, every life they destroyed, every voice they tried to silence." Dominique joined her, standing shoulder to shoulder, her voice cutting through the air with equal force. "We may have won this battle, but corruption does not vanish overnight. It hides. It waits. It rebuilds. So hear me clearly, this is not the end. It is the beginning." The words struck like thunder. The crowd erupted again, but the sisters' faces stayed grave. They had carried the night, but they knew what storms lingered ahead. Maya Green, her arm still in a sling from the attack that nearly killed her, stood at the front with Judge Wilkes and Luis. Their presence was proof that resistance was possible, that allies could rise even in the darkest corners. Morales, now stripped of her badge but freer than she had ever been, moved among the people, her head high. For the first time in years, the town square was filled not with fear, but with hope. Cameras panned across tear-streaked faces, raised fists, chants echoing off the buildings. It was catharsis, a release of decades of silence. But beneath it ran something deeper, something harder. A warning. Dominique's final words carried above the noise, her gaze sweeping over the cameras, over the faces, over the future itself. "We won tonight. But the war against corruption is far from over." The crowd roared louder than before, voices rising like a wave crashing against stone. Some cried, some cheered, some simply stood still, taking in the moment. The sisters stepped back from the podium, their hands brushing together, a quiet gesture of unity. Around them, the system that had tried to bury them lay exposed, broken, but not gone. And as the morning sun rose higher, casting its light over the crowd, everyone knew the truth. Justice had begun, but the fight was only just starting. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.